So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to look at a video by CMI. In case you don't know, Creation Ministries International is an Australian-based young earth creation ministry with branches in several other Anglophone countries, such as Canada, which is where the video I'm responding to was made. CMI split with Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham's organization, after falling out among high-level management of the organization. And in the end, Ken Ham's secretary was accused of being a demon-possessed necrophiliac. So yeah, the two groups don't get along well, despite having basically identical beliefs. Before we start though, I want to thank Cheddar20 for this fun Minecraft skin he created that I'm using as my avatar. If you have fan art, feel free to send it to me on Discord or Twitter. If you are okay with it, I'll feature it in a video and thank you for it. Anyway, this video is about the flood of Noah, so let's see what the guys at CMI Canada have for us.
People have a lot of questions about Noah's flood. Could it really have happened the way the Bible says it did?
Well, there certainly is no evidence that there was ever a worldwide flood, and there's a lot of evidence against it. But it's not like an ontological impossibility. There is a possible world in which the Earth was flooded. We don't live in such a world, though. Here, in reality, no, it's not possible that there was a global flood in which some old dude and his family saved all the land vertebrates on a boat.
Get your questions answered and find out why it matters. This week on Creation Magazine Live.
It matters because some Christians have an absurdly literal view of what is clearly a myth.
This week, our topic is Noah's flood. The flood is the key to understanding this controversial issue of the age of the Earth.
The age of the Earth is exactly as controversial as the shape of the Earth. There is no scientific discourse that supports the Earth being much different from about 4.5 billion years old. Sure, there's some give and take of a few score million years, here or there, but nothing in existence even remotely hints at an Earth as young as CMI would like you to believe. The only functional difference between the absurdity of young Earth creationism and the flat Earth is that the former is better funded, because as a movement it is older and more widespread. Neither have been serious options for models of reality for at least centuries, and neither has any evidence. Instead, both rely on ignorance, both willing and not, stupidity, and dishonesty in varying amounts.
Did the flood really happen the way it's described in the Bible, or was it just a local flood that got exaggerated over time? Could Noah get all those animals on the ark? Where'd the water come from? We're going to address those questions and many more.
Hopefully you do it in a way that's more reasonable than when a flurf explains gravity with density, which, requires gravity to work. I doubt you will, though.
But does it even matter if Noah's flood was really global?
Right, yeah. One of the reasons that it does is because that's the way it's written.
That's not entirely accurate. There are plenty of people of various Abrahamic faiths that don't feel the need to interpret the text so literally, and a not entirely literal reading of a text isn't the same as ignoring the text or being dishonest.
If we can't trust the Bible about events like Noah's flood, then can we trust it when it talks about other events like the birth and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Genesis and the Gospels are different works written by different collections of people thousands of years apart, so I don't think they depend on each other the way these two think they do. But who cares? I'm not here to defend the Bible.
But often people say it was just a local flood.
Yes.
Now, which one is right?
Well, we have a couple options. We have a good, solid geological evidence for the existence of local but extremely large floods at various points in the past, including some during the early archaeological record of the Near East. So we know that there were devastating floods that would have covered the land as far as you could see within a reasonable time frame for cultural memory. We also know with as much certainty as science could ever muster about anything that there was definitely never a global flood as CMI would have us believe. So either the Bible story is based on nothing and wholly made up by the authors, or it's based on a local flood. Those are the only two options.
Well, let's start by looking at biblical and other evidence that the flood was global.
Yeah, the problem is that there's no such thing as quote-unquote biblical evidence that the flood was global. The Bible is the thing that you interpret as making the claim. The most we could do is come to the conclusion that the Bible is indeed claiming a global flood as a historical literal event. But that adds exactly zero evidence for such an event.
Genesis 7:11 and 12 reads, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights."
See, the interesting thing here is that CMI wants us to take all of that very literally, except the windows of heaven. That's just colorful metaphor. The reason for this is because the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, takes for granted an ancient Near East cosmology where the earth is flat and built on pillars with a dome over it, and above and below the earth is a vast cosmic ocean. That's why the Bible talks about things like the floodgates of heaven, the waters above the heavens, the fountains of the great deep, and the foundations of the earth, etc. All of this describes the idea of a flat earth under a dome, above and below which is water, and above it all is the throne of God, whence he watches over his creations.
In verses 19 and 20 we read, "And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep."
When the Bible says the flood waters cover the high mountains, there's nothing wrong with interpreting this as a figure of speech. Sort of like when someone says they're so hungry they could eat a horse. We know that no one could reasonably eat a whole horse. Similarly, we know that no flood could reasonably cover all the mountains. Biblical authors are allowed the same kinds of speech as everyone else. They can use hyperbole, metaphor, etc.
Okay, now a cubit is a distance from your elbow to the end of your hand, about 18 inches. That means the water was more than 20 feet above the mountains.
I mean, unless you're short, and we don't know how big the standard cubit was for the writer, or even if there was such a thing at that time and place.
No wonder the text also says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind."
So this is an interesting verse. You see, CMI, like most young Earth creationists, tend to say that Noah didn't have to include insects and other terrestrial arthropods on the ark, as they don't have the breath of life, according to them. But according to this passage, all the swarming creatures outside the ark perished, and that's a typical biblical description of many insects. So apparently, CMI doesn't take this passage literally either, otherwise they'd have to include insects and the like on the ark. Weird. It's almost like CMI only takes Genesis literally when they think they can get away with it, but don't actually have a consistent standard.
Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days.
150 days, that's 5 months after it began. The waters abated just enough for the ark to come to rest on the mountains of Ararat. But it wasn't until the 27th day of the second month of Noah's 601st year that God told Noah to disembark. That's a year and 10 days after the flood began. Yeah. What kind of a local flood lasts a year and 10 days?
Look, I'm not going to say that it's unreasonable to say the Bible is here trying to convey a literal story. I'm just going to say that it's not the only reasonable interpretation. But let's hear the follow-up.
The duration of the flood also indicates that it was global, not local.
If this was just a local flood, we need to ask some questions.
Yeah.
Like when God used the rainbow as a sign of his promise in Genesis 9:15 that the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Was he talking about a local flood?
He was probably talking about his level of wrath and whatnot. Especially since if you take this literally, it's basically like someone punching you in the jaw and then promising very specifically not to punch you in the jaw again. The very specificity is suspicious if taken literally. Like God isn't promising not to destroy the world by lava or extreme cold or just disintegrating it, if you take this literally. So maybe it would be in the interest of Christians to not make God seem like a guy who's looking for any loophole in his own promises that he can find by interpreting this promise the way a Batezu might.
Also, why did Noah need to build the ark and live on it for a year? Why not just move?
Yeah, that's why you're allowed to interpret nonsensical passages like this as hyperbole. I mean, you at least could do something like that. You already do it for the firmament and the shape of the earth, and God using the earth as his footstools, and the waters above the heavens, and all that stuff that even CMI can't pretend makes scientific sense if taken literally.
And finally, there are over 500 flood legends from all over the world that are all remarkably similar to the Noah's flood account in Genesis.
Because the story is probably an exaggeration of some guy saving his livestock on a raft or something. Again, this is only a problem if you think the literal reading should be your first go-to. I mean, you could take the story as a lesson about how seriously God takes immorality, but how even when everything seems corrupt, he'll save some remnant of those who are not corrupted, like everyone else. But why bother with an actual spiritual meaning that might have an impact on how you act and your attitude towards the world, when instead you can pretend that things that obviously never happened are just part of history?
Even people in remote areas like Fiji and Hawaii have an account of a global flood in their own people's history.
Yeah, why?
Why is that?
Floods occur, and exaggeration is common in legend making. These two things together explain this, and the fact that there are commonalities, like blaming the flood on the wrath of the gods, or the survival of humans on a boat, speak more to the basic logic of a legendary flood than they do to any obvious dependence on a real historical event.
Because all people came from Noah's family, even those in Fiji and Hawaii.
No, the genetics preclude this. The ancestries listed in the Bible don't line up with this possibility, and overall human diversity peaks not in Turkey, but in the area of the African Rift Valley, and declines across migration routes from there. So again, if Noah existed at all, he wasn't the ancestor of all extant humans. In fact, he probably couldn't even have been the single common ancestor of even the Near East populations.
Does it make more sense that memories of hundreds of local floods were distorted to be accounts of global floods, or that there was one massive global catastrophe as the Bible records?
Let's go with that.
It makes sense that hundreds of local floods were exaggerated in obvious ways, especially since we know local floods happen, and that no global flood did. You going with the answer that no one would accept without strong confirmation bias doesn't really help your case that the global flood was real.
The main reason people want to make it a local flood, here it is, is to allow for the millions of years needed for evolution. And let's explain that.
The known age of the Earth is derived independently from evolution. In fact, at one point, before we had our current dating techniques, evolutionary biologists were predicting that the world was much older than most geologists thought. And rather than just accepting this, the geologists pushed back. Because geologists don't care about biologists' pet theories. The fact that as we got better and newer techniques to measure the age of the Earth, that it showed compatibility with evolution is a confirmed prediction for evolution. So at no point was the Earth's age supposed by geologists, based on what was needed for evolution.
Up until the late 18th century, scientists understood that most of the layers of rock full of fossils were the result of Noah's flood.
Right.
But then they started the actual study of specific details of the structure, chemistry, and deposition of these rocks, and realized that most of them couldn't be flood deposits, because many of them were composed of things like fine-grained, non-flocculated shale, and contained things like footprints, burrows, paleosols, and other such traces of life that cannot survive under floods. And such things occurred in vertical sequences, which could even less be explained by a single inundation. Basically, the very second anyone decided to do anything more advanced with geology than just hand-wave it away as the result of the flood was abandoned as a viable hypothesis for the origin of basically any feature of Earth's geology.
Then some geologists like James Hutton suggested that the layers had been formed slowly over millions of years.
Couple things. He didn't give hard numbers to the age of the layers, but he did say that 6 to 10,000 years of existence of Earth simply didn't work, and he didn't suggest this. He showed this beyond any reasonable doubt.
Hutton assumed that the present is the key to the past, which means that if we can see a process like slow and gradual sedimentation or erosion in the present, then it must have always been slow and gradual.
Well, whatever Hutton did, that's not what modern geologists do. And they know that the Earth is older than Hutton and his contemporaries would have guessed. Modern geologists use an actualist approach, where they know that some formations, like banded iron, cannot form today, but what they do assume, like all of science, is that the laws of nature are essentially time invariant. So if modern physics would preclude a rock from forming in a particular way, such as like rapidly from a flood, then physics would preclude it ever happening, meaning that if you see such a rock, you can conclude it wasn't formed by a flood.
This concept is called uniformitarianism, and according to that logic, the layers of rock must have taken millions of years to form, so they couldn't be evidence for Noah's flood.
Yes, according to the laws of physics, which we assume don't just change all willy-nilly, most of the rocks on Earth could not have been formed by a flood, and many have been absolutely dated to be millions of years old.
Yeah, Hutton and in the early 1800s Charles Lyell were trying to apply a different history to the rock record.
No, history is written records of events. They were trying to apply the scientific method to the rock record, and they were largely successful, even if they didn't have as complete a picture then as we do now.
Long ages in geology then influenced Charles Darwin's views in biology.
There we go.
He thought that given millions of years, the little changes within a kind that he was seeing could add up into massive changes evolving one kind into another.
Yes, Charles Darwin's science was influenced by the science that preceded him. That's how science works. We couldn't currently do things like synthesize RNA vaccines that successfully prevent the spread of disease if we decided to delete the whole history of biology, medicine, and synthetic chemistry. Similarly, it wasn't until the Earth was shown to be at least millions of years old that someone could think in time frames long enough to propose other processes which could take place in that time frame. But remember how you said earlier that the great ages of the Earth were made to support evolution, and now you're saying that evolution was based on previous estimates of the great age of the Earth? Those are contradictory statements. You gotta pick a lane.
See, without the millions of years, evolution doesn't work.
Yup, evolution doesn't work without millions of years, just like airplane wings don't work without air. Fortunately for biologists, millions of years are available, and fortunately for pilots, air is available. But also, let's look at that animation. It's a glyptodont morphing into what looks like a Cretaceous didelphodon, into a South American member of the now extinct Leptopterna, into a gorilla. That's just completely insane. All of these organisms represent quite distinct taxa which are not ancestral in any way to each other. This is like failing 8th grade biology levels of dumb.
A famous evolutionist said that the Darwinian revolution began when it became obvious that the Earth was very ancient rather than having been created only 6,000 years ago. This finding was the snowball that started the whole avalanche. If the Earth is young, though, evolution is dead.
That's right, yeah.
Agreed. Which is why I think old Earth anti-evolutionism is not nearly as popular as young Earth creationism. Sure, Reasons to Believe is still pushing it, but really they have a smaller impact on Christians than, say, AIG or CMI seem to. Just look at the funding that pours into projects like the Ark Encounter. Reasons to Believe isn't coming even close.
If those layers are evidence for millions of years, they can't also be evidence for a global flood.
Right, and since we know for a fact, based on multiple independent lines of evidence, that the rock layers are aged millions or even billions of years old, we know that they weren't caused by a flood. Of course, we knew that before we knew the ages, because again, floods can't make every type of rock, and non-flood deposits are the norm in the geological record. So the flood just fails twice here.
Scientists studying fossil sea spiders from Jurassic rock found they are just the same as today's sea spiders. By evolutionary reckoning, that's no change in 160 million years.
No, actually what they found was that in the middle of the Jurassic, the 3 modern families of sea spiders had already diverged, but they were not identical to modern sea spiders. In fact, one major difference is that there is no evidence of Jurassic sea spiders above the bathypelagic zone, indicating that modern shallow water sea spiders may have evolved from deep sea spiders. So right there, this paper suggests physiological evolution within the 3 modern lineages which were established by 160 million years ago. After this, we get an actual commercial.
In that supposed time, evolutionists say, most of the dinosaurs, birds, many fish, and virtually all mammals have evolved, all by natural processes. From finches to albatrosses and mice to elephants, they all made themselves by evolutionary processes. They also say that most of the flowering plants evolved too, and yet the sea spiders haven't changed in all that time.
Except 1, they have changed, and 2, even if they hadn't, evolution doesn't require a certain level of morphological change per unit time. If organisms remain well adapted to their niche, there is no particular reason that they should undergo morphological change. And indeed, there has been relatively little morphological evolution in sea spiders, as well as sharks, horseshoe crabs, vampire squids, lizards, scorpions, and opossums during this time. But that's because all of them were already good at filling their niches, and even after mass extinction events, like the asteroid impact that ended the Mesozoic, they were pre-adapted to the new environments, because all of these body plans are relatively generalized and good at exploiting new resources.
The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 1 that God created plants to produce seed according to each kind created, and He created sea life and creeping things after their kind also. This is the most established principle of biology, that living things produce offspring like themselves. These sea spiders illustrate this biblical truth.
Except that evolution also requires organisms to always produce offspring that share their parents' entire phylogeny. So of course sea spiders have more sea spiders, as evolution requires. This is an area where both creationism and science don't disagree. The question isn't whether organisms maintain their ancestry going forward, it's how far back you can trace ancestry.
Yeah, skeptics claim there's no evidence for a global flood, but what evidence would we expect to find if there was one?
An extensive globally correlated fossiliferous turbidite deposit with hydrologically sorted fossils comprised of organisms from a wide range of ecosystems and members of many currently extinct taxa from what we now consider different geological eras.
What marks would it leave that scientists could find today?
Scour marks, drop stones, and outflow channels across the globe. That'd be a good start.
We would expect huge geologic features like this.
Huge geologic features? Yes. Like that? No. That's a picture of the Grand Canyon, which is characterized by steep walls, many disparate depositional environments in its vertical extent, a winding shape, and dendritic branches. Importantly, many of the rocks here cannot be the result of a flood, such as the Bright Angel Shale, the Hermit Shale, and the Red Wall Limestone, none of which could be deposited in a flood, unless we want to change physics. Then there is the Coconino Sandstone, which wasn't even formed underwater. It's Aeolian sandstone, meaning it was deposited by wind. And how do we know this, you might ask? Well, you see sand dunes in both air and underwater progress in the direction of the fluid currents around them. But the grains spill over the top at a characteristic angle depending on the medium. And even though young Earth creationist Andrew Snelling just lies and says that the angles are consistent with submarine deposition, they aren't. And no actual peer-reviewed paper that I can find has ever said that they were. So the Grand Canyon is exactly what we see when there has been no global flood. Now here's the kind of thing you might expect to see. A spillway on Mars of biblical proportions. Now there was never a global flood on Mars that we know of either, but this is a flood deposit on a scale that we have never seen on Earth. And look at that, it's full of low-slope channel walls, smooth shapes, and teardrop-shaped islands where the water couldn't erode the very hard rock. Exactly what we don't see at the Grand Canyon. Or closer to home, we can see some of the same kinds of formations, albeit on smaller scales, in the scablands of eastern Washington state. But I think we're going to leave CMI here for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit the like button and tell me about it in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit the dislike button and let me know why you didn't. Either way, please share the video and subscribe with the subscribe button below this video. Hit the bell icon and remember to turn on all notifications so you're always notified when there's new Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above: Bob Knob, Bent Hovend, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. My patrons and channel members really help make this channel possible, and without them, this channel wouldn't exist. If you would like to support me, you can click the join link on this channel below this video, or you can click on my Patreon, link in the description, and pledge. On Patreon, there is an option for an annual subscription, which comes with a 10% discount. And joining the channel will give you access to my custom emojis. However, if a regular pledge isn't for you, I do have a merch store. And if monetarily helping out the channel isn't a thing you can do, every like, share, and comment really helps the channel.